Welcome to Modern Farm Business Podcast. This podcast is designed to help the farm leader bring their business to the next level. We'll cover everything from leadership and finance to strategy and planning. I'm your host, Dean Hefta. Joining me today is Richard Schell. He's the Thomas Garrity Professor of Legal Studies, Business Ethics, and Management at Wharton School, as well as chair of the Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department. In his classes, he helps people gain insights into how their personalities and emotions affect the way they negotiate and attempt to influence others. His work is the foundation of his books Bargaining for Advantage, Negotiation Strategies for Reasonable People, and The Art of Woo, Using Strategic Persuasion to Sell Your Ideas. In his latest book, Springboard, Launching Your Personal Search for Success, Richard helps people articulate their own definitions of the word success and help determine how to use their own unique talents and strengths to achieve their long-term life goals. Richard, welcome to the show.
Dean, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'm excited to specifically talk about negotiation today because that's one of the things that you are really well known about, among other things, but in your teaching and writing, you work on negotiation a lot. And to me, negotiation and the skill of negotiation is such a must-have for anybody in business. Could you start us off? Give me a picture of what does good negotiation look like?
Great question, Dean. There are a number of sort of stock schools of negotiation when you look into it. One of them is the win-lose school. And so from their point of view, good negotiation looks like you have a hammer and you try to find other people who aren't very well prepared and you hit them over the head with your hammer and make off with the money. The other school is the win-win school. And in that one, the one great strategy is you collaborate and share truthful information and form great relationships. And then it's sort of a happy ending at the end of every negotiation. My perspective on it is neither of the above. I think really good negotiation comes from self-awareness, that is your own sense of your own personality, your own emotions, your own self-perceptions, and situation awareness, which means you're able to size up in the moment what's going on with the other person, how do they perceive the situation, and then navigate through the experience so that it's a little more adaptive. And sometimes if you're up against someone who has a hammer and they're waiting for you to get distracted until they hit you over the head with their hammer, then I think you have to behave a little differently than if you are sitting with someone who is very cooperative and looking to create a relationship. And one looks like it might be possible from your side. At least you can be open to it and you adapt a more collaborative strategy. So I would say the best negotiation method is to study up on both cooperative and competitive processes, but then use your judgment in the moment to decide how you want to navigate through it. So it's a little bit more like driving on a windy day where it might be a slick road and driving on a sunny day where it's a nice dry road. You drive differently. Same for negotiation.
So it sounds like it isn't that there's one way. It's almost like I'm building a toolbox depending on the situation that I'm in, maybe the thing that I'm negotiating, the person I'm negotiating with. Is that safe to say that?
Yeah. And, you know, if you're negotiating, let's say with a great big agribusiness company, that's going to be a whole different dynamic if, you know, they're the only buyer for the thing you're selling. Or if you're negotiating, you know, with a seed company and you're the rare customer and there's many different options for you to buy from different suppliers, there are going to be different situation dynamics that allow you to behave or to have a strategy that's somewhat different.
Okay. You mentioned, so this self-awareness, you talked about there's the different personalities and kind of the dispositions that I might have as a person. How do I get a sense of kind of my style or me? Could you expand on that self-awareness piece? How do I get better at that?
Sure. Well, I think most people who are effective adults have self-awareness. They may bring it to their marriage or they may bring it to their activities in a social setting, community, and so on. Sometimes they don't bring it to negotiation because they think that negotiation is this separated area of life where you put on some armor and go in and try to behave like you think a negotiator is supposed to behave. But they really have it. So I think personality wise, we get two inputs into how we behave in certain situations. One is our genetic endowment. That is, what kind of people were your parents and what is your sort of orientation toward yourself and other people. And, I would say about 60% of that is genetic. So cooperative people are cooperative people. If any of your listeners have more than one child in their family, same parents, but how on earth did these two children be the product of these two parents? Well, genes mix and mingle and, you come out with a different set of aptitudes. So I kind of at the most basic level say at the tipping point, they're cooperative people who are more relational and more oriented toward helping and more oriented toward social awareness. And then they're competitive people who are more anchored in their own goals and are driving ahead, trying to achieve them. And people are important, but they view the negotiation process a little more as a game or a sport or something that's fun, where they get to interact and see who gets the better deal. The cooperative people are thinking about it much more on a relational setting. Did we have a smooth experience? Did we like each other? And these are partially genetic. On the other hand, and added to that are role models, the way your mom and dad might have negotiated with each other, or if your role model in the family was more your father who was out there and you were brought along to see how he negotiated with some of the people in his life, whether it was in the family business or with your mom who was shopping, then, that's also going to give you some clues especially if they were effective, you want to kind of imitate that. And so we've got these two sides of it. We got the who we are by virtue of who our parents were and our grandparents. And then we've got the socialization part. And I think all it takes to begin to get a handle on this is some reflection. Who are you at your best? What gives you a sense of excitement and vitality when you're being cooperative or when you're being competitive in negotiation settings? I mean, I have a very specific thing in Bargaining for Advantage, the book you mentioned. I have an assessment that takes about 6 minutes. That is a quick survey and you answer some questions and then you can chart the bargaining style that you have on the cooperative or the competitive side. So there are ways to sort of get a snapshot. But, if you don't have a book or a survey in front of you, I think you just need to reflect a little bit. But the sense of enjoyment, the sense of confidence, that's the clue as to which side of this cooperative competitive pivot you fall mainly on. And of course, we're all adaptive. So even if you're cooperative, you know that you need to be competitive sometimes. And even if you're competitive, you need to be cooperative sometimes. But I'm a big believer in play to your strengths. So I think it's really important to know which of those two things is going to be the stretch and which of those two things is going to be the sweet spot.
That makes sense. So if we can think of them as a continuum, cooperative to competitive, too much of a good thing can hold us back. What's a tip if I have a tendency to be very cooperative that I should make sure I manage so I don't hurt myself in negotiation? And then the flip side is, what if I'm naturally really competitive? How do I have to manage that so it doesn't hurt me?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the principal thing is once you sort of sense that it makes you anxious to negotiate over price in a competitive situation, that's probably a sign that you would prefer a cooperative relationship or a cooperative interchange. And if you find yourself on that side, then the number of things can help. One, make sure that you prepare extra well on the competitive dimension. And that means set your goals really carefully, commit yourself to those goals in the sense of doing enough preparation so you really believe that your goal is legitimate, that it's fair, that other people have achieved it, and that's something that you need not be embarrassed to be insistent on. So goal setting and preparation are really helpful cooperative people in competitive settings. I think another trick, and there's some interesting research on women in negotiation. This is a really big generalization, but in general, women tend to be a little more cooperative than men over big studies of lots of people. But one of the things that completely corrects the cooperative tendency in a woman when she has a competitive situation is instead of thinking that she's negotiating on her own behalf, she can actually just flip the switch and take the attitude that she's negotiating on behalf of someone else, and it becomes a cure for being over cooperative. It's interesting. So people who are cooperative generally are reluctant to be competitive because they think it might be selfish or self-serving. On the other hand, if they're thinking that they're negotiating on behalf of their family or negotiating on behalf of a community or a client, then women take a very professional attitude. And once they're in that mode, their ability to be a little more insistent or to be more persistent in pursuing the goal that they think their client or their family deserves suddenly kicks in, and it loses its stress. So thinking about who you're negotiating on behalf of is a really good sort of mental habit to get into. And then a third one is just imagine that you're accountable to someone for the negotiation outcome. So cooperative people often are easy to sort of move around a little bit because they think no one's really going to notice. It's only their perceptions that are at risk in terms of self-esteem or accountability. And since it doesn't matter that much to them what the outcome is, then they give in. But if they tell someone beforehand, their spouse, their hairdresser, their barber, their friend at the local bar, whatever, I'm going into this negotiation tomorrow with person XYZ for this contract, and they tell them what their goal is. I'm going to try to get X. The next day, when they're in that negotiation and they find the impulse to compromise or to give in occurs, there's going to be another little voice that'll come on that'll say, but wait a minute, you're going to have to tell Charlie tomorrow. What kind of story is that going to be? And then you push on with a little more insistence. So those are three things: goal setting, imagine yourself negotiating on behalf of someone else that you need to be effective for, and imagining or even creating an audience that you'll be accountable to.
Perfect. What if my tendency is to naturally be really competitive?
I've taught for over 30 years, and I've taught Navy SEAL Team 6 members. I've taught UN diplomats. I've taught you name it. I've taught them. And over those years, I've found that it's much easier to teach a cooperative person to how to turn up the dial of assertiveness than it is to teach a competitive person how to turn it down. And so in some ways, that's the more challenging adaptation. But a couple of things. First of all, I think highly competitive people are often thinking about their own win more than they're thinking about the other side. So for them, it's really important to remember negotiation is give and take. It's a tennis game. It's something where the other party is playing. And if all you're thinking about is defeating them, they may not want to play with you again. You can win a negotiation and lose a relationship, and that can be so much more costly than the profit you might have gotten out of getting the last 1% out of somebody in a negotiation. So I think it's really helpful for them to realize that the phrase win-win is important to remember, that of course they want to win. That comes naturally to them. But they have to figure out how to give the other side a sense that the other side's won as well. Now, that doesn't mean you actually have to make concessions or be willing to settle for less. It actually means you have to have the relationship arts to set up the other's expectations in a way that your concessions will be meaningful to them and will give them a sense of self-respect and the outcome, so that they feel good about, or at least good enough about, how it all came out and that you treated them fairly. I kind of think of negotiations as a railroad track. And, a railroad track has two rails on it, and the train doesn't run if only one of the rails is working. And the two rails of negotiation are the outcome rail. That's how good are you going to get a deal? What's the deal going to look like for you? And the other rail is the relationship rail. And you have to manage both. You can't just manage one or the other. And so for competitive people, they've got the outcome rail pretty well greased. But the relationship rail, I think they need to pay more attention to. And that means really go out of your way to ask questions about how the other person's doing, what their situation is, show them a lot of respect, have a sense of perspective taking for them, try to get into their shoes a little bit and see what their stresses are. Now, from a competitive point of view, you want to do that anyway, because it's from their stresses that you get your leverage. But it can also be from their stresses that you have opportunities to help them at relatively low cost and do things for them and it doesn't have to, let's say you're negotiating with John Deere, you're up against a giant corporation, but the individual who you're negotiating with is not John Deere. The individual you're negotiating with is a human being with a family, hopes, fears, needs, and dreams and problems. And if you can find out some of those issues on a personal level, you can often do things for them that don't cost you much and that will make them much, much more likely to work with you. I mean, maybe they have a quota for their sales team and it's near some quarterly deadline. And if you close the deal with them, it's going to make them look like stars in some universe that they're in back at home. And you might be able to arrange your proposal in a way that allows them to show that they've closed a deal before this timeline that's important to them personally. And they can work with you and they'll want to work with you again if you show that kind of awareness of what their bullet points are. So getting the other party more prominently into view is a really important habit for the competitive person. And then probably another one is just be aware that any kind of sharp dealing that from your point of view as a competitive person might look like you're playing the game really well, to other people might look like you're compromising your integrity or cutting a corner ethically or bluffing a little too hard, misrepresenting something that they feel has ethical significance. So there's a psychological term that we use in our negotiation studies. It's called the fundamental attribution bias. It's a mouthful, but it's the tendency that people have to explain their own behavior with reference to the situation that prompted it and excuse it. So, well, of course I bluffed. Everybody bluffs. Or of course I misrepresented the deadline because that was the smart move in this negotiation. So from the inside, that looks very smart and rational and situationally required. But on the other hand, from the outside, when you look at other people and you observe that they have lied about something or that they have serve their own interests at your expense in some way that you perceive as selfish, we attribute their actions to their moral character immediately. No situational compassion for other people. Moral labeling immediately occurs. So if you're competitive and you're used to playing a game, if you're dealing with somebody who isn't competitive or as competitive as you, they may decide that you're an unethical person because of what you've done. And people have long memories when it comes to that sort of stuff. So I think you have to kind of go out of your way to be careful, especially careful with the cooperative people that you might be dealing with, not to give them cause to question your integrity. And of course, I'm not saying competitive people have an integrity problem. They don't any more than a cooperative person does, but they can be perceived in a negotiation to be more self-serving. And that triggers this fundamental attribution bias in other people, perhaps unfairly, but it's still there. And so you have to work hard to make sure that you don't let it happen.
I think it's a great point, that attribution bias, because it's at play and we don't even see it because it's happening so quickly and everywhere we look. I'm a big fan of the Bargaining for Advantage book. And in there, you mentioned the phrase, you have to do better because. Why is that such a powerful phrase?
Well, that's one of the things that I suggest cooperative people think about doing, because they get a proposal and it looks like it, is good enough. And so their tendency is to go, okay, whatever, And I suggest one move for a cooperative person to just extend the negotiation by one round is, instead of saying, sure, whatever, they say, well, you'll have to do that better than that because, and the because part's important. The research on compliance and influence is pretty insightful. When people hear a request followed by a reason for the request, an automatic response click happens. And they, about half the time, don't even listen to the reason. It just kicks them into a mode where they are more likely to do what the other person's asking because they hear the because. And so there's some part of our rational processing system that says, well, if there's a reason, then we better, move to them a little bit. The famous experiment on this was done in a library that had a copying machine, and there were a whole bunch of people standing in line, of course, waiting to use the copy machine. And the experimenter had some of their students stand in the line and then try to cut in line to get their copies made a little quicker. And when the student just cut in line and said, excuse me, can I make my copies? They weren't very successful. People just said, there's a line, But when they said, because it was, excuse me, can I cut in line and make my copies because I'm in a hurry? Well, why else would they want to cut in line? So the why I'm in a hurry doesn't really add much to the request. But the compliance rate, people will let them in the line 75% of the time when they use the because statement. So I think when you're negotiating, if you just take an extra step and say, can you do better than that because I haven't heard a reason yet that really persuades me, or because I need to get home by 5:00, or because, my family has a tight budget this month, or because whatever it is, I would suggest that the because statement be true. I'm a big believer in never lying in a negotiation, even when you're doing things that make the whole thing go another round. But once you fill in the reason statement, your chances of being heard and the chances of getting something in response go up pretty dramatically.
Richard, thank you so much. The insights that you gave today, I can't emphasize enough how powerful this is for anybody looking to get better in negotiation. I hope people listen to this 2-3 times because there's a lot here and this is great stuff. Richard, if people want to get more of the stuff you are working on, the things that you've written about, where would you direct them?
Well, Bargaining for Advantage has been in print for 25 years. It's in 16 foreign languages, and it's on Amazon.com, and it's easy as pie to buy. So it only costs, I think, $15 or something. It's a paperback. So the first port of call I would suggest is Bargaining for Advantage, and you can get it in many bookstores, but you can get it online very easily. It's at Walmart.com, all the other places you can buy books. And The Art of Woo, Winning Others Over, is a sort of complementary book. That's about influence and persuasion. And of course, whenever you're negotiating, you're also influencing and persuading. So the two books together do make a kind of bookshelf for interpersonal effectiveness. And they both have personal assessments that help people figure out their own individual styles. And then, of course, both of them have the kinds of insights we talked about to help you adapt your style to be effective in whatever the situation that you find yourself in is. So I would suggest those two books are a good starter kit. Once you get interested in it, of course, there are many other books and some online courses people can take and stuff like that. But the books are a good start.
Excellent. And we'll have links to that in our show notes. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. We had Professor Richard Schell, author of Bargaining for Advantage and The Art of Woo, professor at Wharton School. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dean. It's a pleasure.
Wow, some great insights into such an important topic. A few things that stood out to me was recognizing that many people think you have to approach it one of two ways, either from a win-lose standpoint or from a win-win. The reality is that competitive and cooperative approach isn't just one best way. Those are different tools that we can use in different situations. So we have to be self-aware and be able to adapt to the situation and not feel like there's only one best way. The second was prepare for the areas that you have anxiety about. If you're naturally more cooperative in your negotiation, make sure you're clear on your goals. Think in terms of negotiating on behalf of somebody and communicate ahead of time and be accountable to somebody about what you want to achieve. And finally, be thinking about the outcome and the relationship throughout the process. We have to manage both of those the entire time. We not only want to be focusing on what we want to achieve, but also how do we continue to build and strengthen the relationship through the process. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Modern Farm Business. I look forward to having you with me next week. And if you have any thoughts or ideas, please pass them along to dean@modernfarmbusiness.com. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get podcasts and tell a friend about what we have going on here. Thanks.